Hello, my name's Oscar Clark, and I am on a quest to learn everything about the game economy design and the commercial aspects of making games. And I'm delighted to be joined by Archie. Archie, tell us a little bit about what you do and particularly what you're doing at Stash.
Hi, good to meet all of you. My name is Archie Stonehill. I'm the head of product at Stash. Stash is a startup that's focused on helping developers build direct-to-consumer relationships with their players. So building channels that let you interface, more directly in a back and forth with your players. Those are kind of pretty much limited these days to web shops and desktop launchers. Before joining Stash, I was in the games industry as an investor at a fund called Makers Fund, where I did a lot of European work and mobile specifically.
And a lot of great games came out of that kind of era as well. So, you've got a great track record with that. Now, obviously, one of the things that's really interesting for me right now, and the reason why I wanted to have this conversation is you gave a great talk at Pocket Gamer where you specifically looked at the arising nature of direct-to-consumer. Now, traditionally, we haven't seen that kind of direct-consumer engagement from most game teams, although there have been examples. Do you want to kind of just for you, what is that quintessential thing that makes direct-to-consumer stand out and interesting?
Yeah, I think it is. It kind of goes back all the way to the beginning of the games industry, where you've always had intermediation in the games industry.
Yeah.
Normally several layers, right? I think originally games were arcades, and then you had consoles. So instantly you had the consoles as an intermediary between the developers of the games and the players. But you also had retail outlets, often brick and mortar retail outlets like GameStop. And what was interesting back then is one of the reasons the publishers were so powerful is they had a lot of leverage over the retailers, and the retailers could make or break
distribution.
the game. So so distribution was thought of as a really core competency of getting a game out. And EA would launch new franchises like The Sims off the back of their established franchises like Madden. And there was this kind of very kind of important power and relationship that the publishers had and that the retailers had. So we had one wave of disintermediation in the games industry, which was the shift from physical to digital. You lost a lot of retail power there, right? So GameStop is nowhere near as powerful today as it was back then.
But it's interesting how long that took. I mean, I would argue that games are a naturally digital format.
Yeah.
And I say that from the perspective of a guy who bought Wolfenstein off the back of a lorry with not quite that bad, but I got a physical disc that I got off somebody who'd copied it from downloading it from a bulletin board.
Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
literally shareware.
Shareware, yeah.
And yet, we established this framework that was so physically distributed so relatively rapidly for it to then disappear almost. I mean, I still go into CES and various other places, and I will still occasionally buy certain physical media, but it's very rare.
Yeah, and I think it as you say, games are a technology product, right? Yeah. So they would naturally lend themselves to a digital distribution strategy. However, but it took much longer for games to shift from physical to digital than other entertainment media. And I think there's a couple of reasons. So one is just pure practical from the technology perspective. Games are bigger than movies or TV series and music, so it took longer for the internet infrastructure to get to the point where it was viable for purely digital distribution.
That's fair.
But I also think that the curious nature of game discovery, for new game discovery and acquiring new users, led to this being slow. I probably have to think a bit more about this, but there weren't as many clear opportunities to advertise games in an obvious way as there are, for example, in music and movies and television, where you had a lot of free consumption of those products. So you could advertise TV on the cable networks, movies in movie theaters and billboards. So games relied a bit more on retail distribution as a marketing forum. And so I think that's probably another reason it took a long time. And that dynamic persisted in that there is still a really close relationship, particularly on something like PC, between distribution and marketing and where you get it, right? Steam is still a really important user acquisition tool for game developers, just like GameStop was too.
Yeah, and I would argue, I mean, I remember when I was at Real Networks in 2000, literally 2000, when we were talking to this Seattle-based company wanting to do streamed games. So they were literally, Steam were that company, and they were talking about doing streaming of games before it was ever a major kind of PC gaming platform. But I'd argue they saved the PC gaming industry, arguably. You actually remind me of something else. I'm going to go John back to you said. I've always made light of the fact that games is the only medium where we can advertise other games in our game and it's all good. But actually, you've reminded me that cinema does that.
Yeah.
And arguably, radio stations are that.
And TV too. Yeah,
and
I
TV
agree with
too.
you about radio. Yeah.
It hadn't even occurred to me that there's a really interesting correlation, which is the media that we're in allows us and fosters our interest in more of that media.
Yeah, because it seems a bit bubble-ish, right? Where like hyper-casual games are making money by advertising other hyper-casual games. But ultimately, someone's got to be paying for something. And I think where games excel is that ultimately games pay for themselves in a way that maybe TV didn't always, because they just relied on advertising revenues.
Well, they relied on external brands to bring the value. And we haven't got that necessity. In fact, I'd argue we've not been very good generally at getting external brands to believe in
much to our detriment. Yeah,
much to our detriment.
I agree.
I mean, don't get me wrong. There are pioneers. I think Red Bull, in particular, are an absolute pioneer when it comes to understanding that games connects with their audience.
Some of these fashion brands too.
Fashion brands.
New Fortnite thing.
We had Lynn Rosse.
But I agree. It's taken a while.
Would you believe Lynn Rosse? Furniture advanced enough to want to be in a game.
Well, Design Home, is really interesting. A lot of what Covet did as well with, so what Crowdstar did in Glue, I think is super cool in terms of like, rather than just shoveling some branded content into games, actually integrating the brands with gameplay is how it's best to be done.
And I know we're rolling on a wide area here, but there's a reason, there's a method in my madness, because I think what we're really talking about is, at its heart, a game player is a consumer of various forms of media, and not just games. And it's not actually just media, it's the consumer of all other goods and other services and so on and so forth. And at the heart of any consumer kind of journey is an understanding of how we gain awareness, we build interest, we create desire, and we call to action. So that's kind of bringing us full circle back to, from introduction, setting the scene, to where you were talking in terms of direct to consumer. So now, historically in games, as we say, we've moved from this physical retail into this digital retail, but where the power is being kept inside some small numbers of stakeholders, and Apple being Apple and Google, Steam, and the console platforms being the main examples. But what is different now? What's changing now?
Yeah, and that's really, by the way, notable, because most other industries, when they had tech-enabled distribution that disintermediated conventional retailers, most of them that was associated with a higher degree of direct-to-consumer. And it may have taken time, right? So when you went from clothes, for example, or I like to give the example of like shoes, where Nike went from selling through Foot Locker stores, maybe then it went through selling through Foot Locker website to then selling from Nike.com directly. And now games are in that like footlocker.com to Nike.com directly. And the reason for that shift, I think there's multiple reasons. So on the kind of supply side, so one of the big reasons is there's changing policies and regulations. So one of the reasons game developers don't distribute directly to players is they can't. They're not allowed to.
They're not
by
allowed to.
Apple, Google, or the consoles, right? You can't sell.
Technically, they're not allowed to signpost, if I understand correctly.
We'll get into this, but it gets nuanced. But certainly until recently, they weren't allowed to do a lot. They weren't allowed to. You had to be very, very careful, or you get kicked off the platform. And if you're a mobile game developer, getting kicked off Apple or Google, that's existential.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I find this really interesting is because I did dabble in the blockchain. I own up to that. Only once. The game I designed, which didn't do very well, but that's another subject. But the game I designed was the first game Apple approved that had blockchain. Wow. Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic thing to be in a position with. But the reason we managed it is because we complied with their rules.
Yeah.
Their rules said that if you have a book or an external piece of media, it is okay for your application to use that, provided you weren't absolutely locked into the kind of chain, as long as you didn't signpost. And the reason why that was fine is because we could then do the direct retail of the blockchain side separately. We actually even gave Apple a cutback, essentially, because we required a thing called blueprints, which is a currency that you could buy in the game to be able to convert your blockchain item into a playable item. I mean, again, it's just, I mention all this only from the point of view that we have been able for a very, very long time, and that was 2016, no, 2019, I think, when we did that. But the logic was there previous to that. And yet here we are, 7 or so years later, and only now are we starting to see some real seismic shifts in terms of this direct-to-consumer model.
Yeah, so you are correct. So the policies Apple and Google have in place, there's basically kind of three that matter. So the first is how do you distribute your game? So what's known as sideloading is distributing your game outside of an official app store. That has been absolutely prohibited by Apple and made very difficult by Google for a long time. But Google, you still can technically sideload on Android. The second thing that matters is what payment rails or how you transact within your game. And this is what I think a lot of developers have come to understand and players don't understand. When you buy something in a game on the App Store that you download from the App Store, you are not buying from the developer. You are buying from Apple or Google. That is who bills you. That is like who has your data. You're a customer of them. And then they give the developers some money a few weeks later. But you're not actually interacting with the game developer pretty much at all in that transaction. So the game developer...
Well, you weren't, but now with the age appropriate... No, not the age appropriate design code. It's... it's triggered by the age appropriate design code in the UK, but it's also part of wider legislation that's going on across the world, where we are essentially being asked to know our customer when we don't know that it's not our customer.
Yeah.
They're the store's customer, and I think we're making, again, it's an aside, I think this kind of lack of understanding amongst regulators and customers is making customers more at risk as a result, arguably. But anyway, that's my aside. I will fight on that hill.
But
I have a particular bugbear about that, but carry on.
So when it comes to kind of payments, basically you have to use Apple and Google's kind of payment system, and that is more than just payments. It's also customer data, it's also returns. So it sounds boring, payments is important payments. And then the third thing is, where can you actually communicate with your players about our store channels, and how do you actually get player data? So even if they're interacting with your game in the apps through the App Store, are you actually selling them things or emailing them outside? And for that, so on the first front, sideloading, we're seeing changes. This is mostly driven by regulatory changes. Yes. So the Digital Markets Act in Europe, the DMCC in the UK, there's some legislation in Japan and South Korea, and then even America has seen some action in the court system that's all like opening up the App Store. So for the first time, Apple allows sideloaded applications in Europe now as part of the Digital Markets Act.
Would you say, because I know Epic in particular have been very aggressive in this space. Do you think that's just a symptom, or do you think they've accelerated this conversation?
That's a really good question. Epic is fascinating. So Epic have definitely accelerated this conversation. And you know that because the most important, arguably the biggest win for antitrust in the digital era was Epic's victory against Google in December 2023. So Epic launched, deliberately non-complied with the App Store policies on Apple and Google's App Stores in 2020 when they launched an alternative payment rail for Fortnite, upon which Google and Apple both kicked Fortnite off the App Stores, and Epic sued them with a full PR campaign prepped. And they pursued two cases, one against Apple, one against Google. The one against Apple, they mostly lost. They won on one of 12 counts, which was about link out payments. But the one on Google, which they chose to have in front of a jury instead of a judge, they won on every count. And it was kind of a landmark ruling. And the remedy for it is on pause right now. But in theory, the remedy for it will force Google to basically anything developers want to do in their app store. Be very exciting.
Very exciting indeed. And also with the upcoming Digital Markets Act, at the time of writing the book, this hasn't happened yet, but there's lots of foreshadowing that this could be very positive.
Well, the DMA technically is live.
Is it? Oh, okay. I thought it wasn't.
It is, yeah. So it went live on March 7th, 2024, and I think the app stores had a few months to start complying. So now you can already download, if you're living in the EU, you can download Epic Game Store on iPhone, which is huge, right? It's amazing to iPhone players. And then the UK should be happening in 2025. But the thing that still remains to be seen is the EU is pursuing some quite aggressive investigations, charges against Apple for non-compliance. So we could see a further open up.
But it's interesting because arguably you've been able to do this on Google for a very long time.
Yes.
So yeah, the Google are the ones that lost.
I know, which just seems really unfair. But that comes down to peculiarities of like, it's almost like Apple is so restrictive that it's simple, whereas Google, so with Google, you are theoretically allowed to sideload, but they have blocked the creation of real competitive marketplaces in a few ways. One is by dissuading the original device manufacturers from really investing in this. So Samsung, those guys, they've cut very sweet deals, and they've also made them sign some kind of dodgy terms where basically in order to support Android, you have to agree you won't, for example, offer exclusive content distributed outside of the Google Play Store. So anything you distribute has to also be distributable through the Play Store. So they've blocked the OEMs. They've also just paid off a bunch of developers. So it was called Project Hug. All these details came out in the Epic case. It was amazing. And they were paying hundreds of millions of dollars to Riot and Activision to get them to not launch a competitive app store.
Yeah.
And they offered to pay Epic off, but Tim Sweeney's such a hero that I think he's fighting for everyone. And then they also create a really bad user experience to sideload. There's like 3 different screens that are like, this will give you a virus and you'll lose all your stuff.
Yeah,
and you have to be like, I don't care, I want to delete all my stuff in order to accept it.
As someone because I used to be the mobile operator guy for 3, and so a lot of the guys that went on to do the OEM stores are former colleagues or friends of mine.
Oh, yeah.
Well, not entirely the case, but quite often there was somebody who I had a connection with. And there was a lot of effort that was put in by some of those stores, particularly the kind of the Samsungs of this world. Huawei was also quite active, but obviously that's become a messy thing in itself.
Well, yeah, because they've launched their own operating system too.
Yeah, well, they had to because of everything that was happening last time we had this merry-go-round. But the thing that strikes me is that there has always been an issue, which is that the trusted store is the one that is the brand. And so having an additional store creates this challenge of choice. There's a sort of tyranny of choice that goes on. And we're back to this discovery question. And as you've said already, unlike other circumstances, other medium, other formats, we haven't had this disambiguation of channel that we've seen elsewhere. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I would say that I think it is curious. Like, I think if you're excited about this movement in games, the direct-to-consumer movement, you have to think very seriously about why no Android store has taken off as a really real competitor to Google. And I think undoubtedly that is like Google's doing, right? And I think mostly it comes down to the user experience blockers they've put up, because unlike kind of PC games, where really Steam's algorithm is very important for organic discovery, the app stores are no longer really important for 99, very, very few games are really benefiting from organic installs. Either, they're useless or you don't get them because you're not featured. And that's partly because both Apple and Google have now monetized all the organic users they used to give away because Apple launched an ad network. So
I don't know of anyone who gets a feature bump anymore. Yeah,
exactly. And all of those spaces that used to be given away for editorial are now monetized. So, but on mobile still, you have the programmatic app ecosystem. And so if it was equally easy for a player to download an app from an alternative app store as it is from Google Play, and that app store was viably competing on cost vis-a-vis developers, then of course developers would direct players to download from the Samsung store instead.
And surely the search would show that.
Yes, but I think, and I think the challenge is that, developers, if there's any friction in terms of like downloading from one channel versus another, developers will go for the lower friction channel. And that's why you have players. Yes, true. But developers have some control over where they direct players, right? So for example, just deep linking to Samsung instead of Google in your ad creative, right? But if that leads to a 10% drop off in players actually downloading the game because there's a scare screen that pops up and it goes like, this is an unknown distribution channel. Are you sure you're okay with it? Like, developers haven't opted into it. And a lot of these regulations are going after the user experience, like the usability, these scare screens. So that's somewhere Google faced a lot of scrutiny from in America even. So as hopefully those policies come into effect and force Apple and Google to make this a smoother user experience, I think you could see developers saying like, hey, if I get this player to download from this other channel, I'm making 25% more revenue. in all my ad campaigns from now on, I'm no longer going to direct to the app stores, which could be an enormous opportunity as that user experience becomes less frictionful.
Yeah, and I think that's let's talk a little bit more about friction, because I mean, to talk about more kind of theory, we're talking about quite a heady change of a market, and I know, and the book itself is supposed to be more about focusing on the theoretical sides of things, but I'm really glad we had that conversation, because I think it's, for anyone who's trying to understand what's going on right now at this point in time, I think it's an incredibly important starter for 10 to get our heads in the game. Now, as somebody who is building direct consumer experiences, what are the fundamental things that you need, you think about in terms of the journey that goes
100%.
on? I mean, what is it? What is it about the journey that people should be thinking about?
I think the thing you need to always have in your mind is that a direct consumer channel will always be less convenient than a third-party channel. And that's true in anything, right? It is easier to go to like Macy's to buy my clothes than it is to go to a specific store brand, because I have more options, I have more pricing, I can compare. And so
familiarity, trust, all that kind of stuff.
Precisely.
Brand.
Yes, exactly. So you're not trying to make a more convenient experience. Now, you are trying to reduce friction as much as possible, but like that's never going to be where you win, and if you try and win, you'll lose. So where you can win is in making it a better experience with additive kind of like stuff, whatever you think would complement your game, in order to get players to opt in to that channel. And I think that where a lot of developers that have done direct to consumer have gone wrong is they've tried to use exclusive distribution as like a sledgehammer to bully players into using their first-party channels, and that's largely failed. So you can look at what's happened on PC with a lot of the AAAs, right? Like Blizzard, EA, and Ubisoft have all tried to remove themselves from the Steam ecosystem by only offering their games through their first-party launchers, and they've all basically failed.
All failed.
And so, all of them, right? Like, Diablo's on Steam now, so... But Stash, what we try and do is very much like not that, right? We try and use a lot more nuance, and instead of taking away, being like punishing players if they don't use your channel, you got to reward them if they do. So, keep your content on both, but make the best, we say Stash is the best way to pay and play. So make the better way to pay and play your first party channel. So, but what's important to note there is that means you're designing an experience not for scaling your game with new users, right? If you want to scale your game, use a third party marketplace in general. Far easier, you'll get natural users, they know the interface. You're making a direct-to-consumer channel is for your most engaged, highest intent customers. So often ones who've already bought into playing your game.
But what it sounds to me is that basically we're talking about classic service experiences.
Yes.
At the end of the day, we're trying to not... It's one of the sort of the earliest lessons I ever got was marketing is about identifying and satisfying consumer needs. You're not creating a commodity. You could argue that the OEMs is a commodity because everything is there. You go get it. That's nice and quick and easy. Instead, you're creating a value-added proposition. And I mean, what that value add is obviously depends on what you're trying to do. But that seems to me the crux of it.
Completely. And I think then you think about, okay, well, what is the value add? And what the other great thing about that is like, well, we call them as gameplay enhancing experiences. Yeah. And so not only do they induce players to opt into this first party channel, but they also actually improve the experience of your game. So you can achieve multiple business objectives with them. And I think then where you get to the specifics, that really depends on what game you have, who your players are, and what you're trying to achieve. So if you have a competitive game, let's say, a real-time PvP competitive game where you're trying to boost new user kind of retention, then you might orient one path in this direct-to-consumer experience towards like new player onboarding, mastery, progress. And what's great about your direct-to-consumer channel is you have a lot more freedom in terms of what you can do. Like the app stores and third-party stores really restrict what you can do in terms of describing your game, different paths, different channel experiences. You just aren't allowed to do certain things. So the nice thing about your first-party channels is you have complete freedom. So for example, like when we build a desktop launcher for a customer that's a real-time PvP game trying to, improve new player onboarding, we'll create like an onboarding checklist. We'll create, a personalized content feed with new content related to that specific player's gameplay and try and gamify like the kind of, broader meta onboarding of the player. So have they joined the Discord? Yes. If so, they get points. Have they Maddie two friends? Have they watched this video, etc.? So you really can construct the player's experience around the game. And not only is that getting them to use a channel where you make more money, because I don't think we've said this yet, but like the main reason people like direct to consumer is it cuts out a 30% middleman, right? So Apple and Google take 30% of gross revenue. So does Steam. So direct-to-consumer channels are often taking 5 to 10. So you're making 25% plus more revenue. And you can do it while improving new player onboarding, for example.
Absolutely. And I think, the thing about this is that whatever your value add is down to you as the developer. Build, because at the end of the day, one thing I think we're learning from building ethical kind of monetization models in games is that it all comes down to delivering value for the player by understanding what they care about, which means that we're building experiences that are tied into what makes playing more interesting. So if we're using a direct-to-consumer channel, understanding how we get somebody to go and say, this game is interesting, I'm going to try it, from that to I now know where this game fits into my daily routine, to I'm now engaged with this game, how do I find other people? Because let's face it, most services in games are largely communities, it's driven at least. Where am I going to get that? But if you're going to do that, you're going to get into the whole sort of social identity. How do I identify with my tribe? Well, why wouldn't you do that on your own space where you can commercialize that experience?
Yeah, precisely. And I think what you're getting at is really fundamental, which is like direct to consumer is more than just like a technical monetization and distribution question. It's really about like an engagement between you and your players and a two-way engagement. So, the first step in any direct to consumer channel is establishing that communication channel. And often the first thing a developer will have to do if they're launching direct to consumer is start getting player email addresses and getting ways to communicate with them outside of just the game environment. And then, adding the kind of like additive gameplay enhancing experiences from there is largely about what you're doing to facilitate better needs for your players. And we always start with the players. Like we'll often go into Discord, see what they're saying, talk to them, play the game a lot. But also developers can notice stuff their communities are already doing. And a lot of what we do takes inspiration from what players are already doing for games that they love. Looking at, are people coaching one another? What kind of content are they sharing? Even are they building certain tools? Like I'm a big Raid Shadow Legends player, and there's an amazing set of tools that the players have built that are kind of like use some deep permissions to extract data from the game and then construct like artifact optimizers to help you optimize your build, or team optimizers to see what teams other people are running. And so I would look at like what your players are also already doing and thinking about how can you improve that and enable it and integrate it into your direct consumer channel. But going back to different things, different games, I think this is really fundamental to what we do at Stash. And it's one of the reasons we try and only work with studios above a certain size, because really I think if you want to build this best way to pay and play, you have to invest quite heavily in doing something custom and bespoke.
And you need a sizable enough audience to take advantage of it.
And a deep enough game to make, the assets that you're building worthwhile. But there are some general rules by genre, right? So things that work for a casino game are going to be pretty transferable. And that's normally about rewarding loyalty, doing some more rewards, creating a sense of VIP exclusivity. Strategy games, it's a lot about mastery, builds, meta games, content, tier lists, that kind of thing. RPGs, it could also be about your universe, transmedia content, communities, social groups. Like we often try and enable social discovery so people can meet one another. So I think of our direct-to-consumer offerings as fitting into 3 buckets. One is content. So that could be content you create, or it could be content you help the community create. And that relates to, guides, onboarding, but it also is your universe, your lore, your fan art. You can do fan art competitions, player-generated content. Then there's community. So I think a lot of games already have really good social systems integrated into the game. What games I don't think are as good at is enabling social discovery. So building communities. So we make looking for group tools, matchmaking for ranked matchmaking, team finding, clan finding, etc. And then the third
one of the things about that always gets me is that some of the stuff we discovered when we made PlayStation Home is the missed opportunity we didn't have, which is once I've played the game, I want to go somewhere to gather with the people I've just been playing with and debrief. And it's still one of my biggest, sense of failures. I never managed to convince the Sony management that we needed a on exit of game, go to home. Everyone was focused on launching from home, which I think was the wrong way to go. And I know I'm going off on one, but I think this idea that you can use these environments to create these spaces, because what do people love to do after they've done an activity is talk about it.
Yeah. No, I like that. And it could be like a physical 3D space, or like or it could be content feeds and sharing, right? Like, I think that creating ways for them to engage with your game outside of games, outside the gameplay, is exactly what you want to do, and players love it.
Yeah, exactly. And what's been interesting for me is that a lot of the vanity products that we talk about, I mean, the consumable, make the fireworks go off, or the permanent where I kind of wear the hat of wonder or whatever else, they only really matter when people that we care about see us using them.
Yeah.
And, if we can find ways of extending from the play into this community service experience, and then that includes for me, streaming and, content creation and sharing, all the other stuff, that to me is a quintessential part. And if we happen to be doing that and you go, oh, I like that hat, and I'm currently in my direct to consumer space, then I'm getting the profit margin for that at the same time.
Yes, and I think that giving players reasons to create content is really fun like that. And so we often will create like trophy cabinet systems where you can just see like all the progress you've made. Like, people are often like, how does this work for a match game or a merge game? But like, one of the things I love in merge games is showing players like how many things they've merged, what the merge paths they've done are. So you can actually... And, you might not think there's like much of a social status element to merge games, right? As opposed to other games with cosmetics, but like there is. And if you create trophy cabinet exports that people can share on Facebook, players do it. Like Monopoly Go has a great version of this.
The only caveat I found that, and this is maybe my bias showing, and we had a nightmare because we were not backed by Sony management to have standardized trophies for PlayStation that we could put into despite the fact they promised it. They didn't let us make force teams to actually provide us with the trophies. The issue I have is cross-game. And my view is that communities are most effective where you're dealing with the Venn diagram of the community. And there are certain exceptions. I think your focus on larger games resolves that problem because they're big enough games with enough momentum to be able to have down their own. But for a lot of games, they are part of a mix of experiences. And I think the challenge from a direct-to-consumer point of view is somebody who managed to find a good way to connect multiple communities will create more eyeballs that can drive more users to more games, therefore creating a better experience for multiple developers, in my opinion. Do you have any views on that?
It would be the dream, right? It's the dream if you could do it. And I think that I do. And I think that one of the challenges you always face there is a cold start problem, where like the only reason players will buy into this is if you have the right portfolio of games, but the only way to get games bought into it is if you already have the players and it's something for them to game.
Yeah. And taking me back to PlayStation Home and why that didn't quite work.
And if they can't make it work, I mean, who knows, right? Like,
that was politics.
Potentially something Stash could do in the future, right? Like if we scale far enough, I think there's some really exciting things we could do as like a neutral third party. And then the other challenge I think you have is like finding the right portfolio of games that fit together. I think you see this a lot in large studios that have portfolios of games and try and do a cross-game offering, but like maybe those games don't fit together that well. So can you find and a lot of players will only really play a handful of games, and certainly often one or two in each genre. So you look at Zynga's portfolio, it's amazing, right? They have Peak with match games, they have the Zynga social casino games, but they also have Farmville, they also have Gram games like with Merge Dragons, and then they have Rollic, and I'm like, okay, well what is the Venn diagrams of Zynga game players and like who's playing multiple games? And it's very hard to find a combination that works.
No, I totally get it. And I think, but this is the reason I'm asking is because I think it emphasizes some of the challenges and the tensions involved. Yeah. So at one end, you've got an individual developer wants to make something, but for that to be super successful, they've got to already be successful. Or they need to go somewhere where there's enough of an audience they're going to want their thing. And I think that's the sort of push me, pull you part of this conundrum, which is, I think, if you're already a successful game, this direct consumer stuff is absolute no-brainer. I personally think it's still a no-brainer even if you're not that game. But to your point earlier, there's cost, there's management, there's process. There gets to be a point where that there's a threshold.
Yeah.
How do we reduce that threshold?
So I think that it's becoming simpler and easier for anyone to launch some version of direct to consumer. So I do think there are some things as a small developers, no regrets, you should do. Like you should start getting, emails from your players. I think what matters really is, do you have a game that players engage deeply enough with? Like, no matter the scale of your game, if you have players that are playing it for 100 hours, this is worth exploring, And it doesn't have to be 100 hours, but if you are a pure play, hyper casual developer, that no one's going to be bought in enough to your games to be. But Voodoo or Homa or Say Games 100% should be doing direct to consumer. So as you start getting more intense, I think that the kind of technical aspects of offering out of app payments, so web shops and stuff like that, that's becoming so simple that pretty much anyone can do it. But if you build it, they won't necessarily come. And then the real question is how do you actually make the strategy a success by gathering player data and crafting you have to put some thought into the design, but there are some pretty quick wins. If you just want to direct traffic to the store, you can create some high value bundles that your players can go there to get. And then even beyond that, just creating a news feed with content you're updating or some tongue-in-cheek lore. I think it's no more than one person's work, and often you can have resources within your team. The final thing I'll say about how smaller studios can do this is empower your community. Use your most bought-in players to fuel this ecosystem. But a lot of games have had huge success with that. Raid is really built on the back of its community, and smaller games. A lot of these small games, they have a few players who love them. Really love them. I look at Pixel Federation as a great example there.
Yes, that is a good example. So I'm going to try and kind of think about the other side of it. So the challenges involved in this process. So obviously, you can go to a third party like yourselves to be able, to do this stuff. But what are the things that you've got to overcome? So, to my mind, it's you need some level of institutional knowledge, the rules that you are currently governed by, and that might change, but currently you're governed by, say we can't signpost. So presumably you've got to provide some sort of layer, some reason to go to that third-party space. Well, not third-party, your personal, your team's space. And then from that space, having a mechanism that isn't blatant by now, that gets them to the point where they can then go off and buy something. How does somebody trying to do that think about this conundrum?
Yeah.
How do they resolve that?
Just on the rules, that's the landmine you got to watch out for. And the rule there is you can't advertise, say, an alternative payment method from within the app environment if you're distributed from Apple and Google.
Yeah.
So what you can't do is be hey, if you go to our website, you can buy it, or link out to your website where you can buy it. But you can advertise anything else that isn't a direct purchase. So the way that we get around this a lot of the time is we'll create loyalty programs that have engagement-based progress. So as you play, you accumulate loyalty progress. And then you can tell players about that from within the app and say, hey, go to your website. And then the rule that some people in the industry follow, although it's not known if this is accurate, is you want to be 2 clicks away if you're linking out from your game from making a purchase. So you can't link directly to the store. So assuming you're doing that, I think then what was the rest of your question?
Well, it's just you've got, how do I get them from my app to my space to then purchase? That 2-click.
So there's the stuff you can link out from in-game. And then the other thing I mentioned is one of your first objectives in a D2C channel is to establish out-of-app communication channels. So that could be a Discord server. It could be social media. Social media and Discord are the main 2 channels. Or it could be emails if you start getting emails for email marketing. And that, by the way, why is this happening now is one of the questions you asked. One of the big reasons it's happening, it's taken off in the last 5 years, is because there was an App Store change that said it used to be the case that you could not inform players about that if you acquired contact information from within the app environment, you could not use out-of-app communication channels to tell them about alternative ways to pay. So if I got your email from the app, I couldn't email you saying, hey, you can use our web shop. That changed in about 2020.
And that's a massive change.
Huge.
That makes it, and let's face it, I would argue it was an anti-competitive process, basically.
For sure, yes.
I'm trying not to get myself barred by lots of people I know at certain platforms. But the point is that that is something which is it should be a fairly normal practice. But there is a lot of sensitivity, I think, even amongst users, not another place where I'm going to have to give away my email. So I think you've got to exchange value. So it's a reciprocation thing. You know, we're asking you to trust us with your email. We're going to use that properly. We're going to be compliant with all this privacy stuff, but also you're getting this loyalty, for example.
Totally, 100%. And so you originally brought me on here because of the user journey stuff. So we could even just structuring it like that. Like, so you think about, okay, how do you actually get them into the channel? I think we've spoken about that a bit. You first have to let them know about it, and you have to just bring them to an environment outside the App Store. So normally web is great for that. No matter what your strategy is, web is great because it's easy to set up web stores, web interfaces. Players are already familiar with it. It's low friction. Once you get them there, you really want to establish, like, you want to get some kind of ongoing communication with them. So join a social media channel, get them to join a Discord server, or give you their email. And I completely agree. You need to give them a motivation. So once they arrive at the web environment, like, you want to tell them what the deal is. Like, why are you doing this to me as a player? And to some extent, I think you can just, like, there's more and more studios I see actually educating their users about, like, hey, Apple and Google take 30% of what you spend. So it really helps us out if you come here. And, you know, you can rely on the generosity of spirit of your players, and often they have goodwill. But then the other ways you get them to visit, like, you get them to value this channel are, like, that's kind of what I was saying about our content community and commerce solutions, is like we think about the engagement drivers and the channel incentives in those three buckets. So you either give them a reason to visit this environment that isn't commerce related, like that's what content can they access, what systems can they engage with? Is there other things that enhance their experience of your game? Can they meet people? Can they see lore videos like what Riot's done with Arcane, right? There's mini versions of that you can do. And, like, I think that's great. And then there's also the commercial aspect, which is nice because you have additional margin you can play with because you're making 25% more every time they spend $1. You can give some of that back to the player. Yeah, exactly. So it's a win-win-win. The only one you're losing are the app stores. But the best thing to do there is, like, implement those things. Implement any discount or rewards you're giving in the most effective way. We can talk about some relatively tactical aspects there, but really that's about, like, making it a fun and interactive experience for the player, not just like a pure transactional, like, okay, fine, we take 15, you take 10.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go a little bit further. I don't think necessarily the app stores are necessarily... I don't think it's a zero-sum game.
I agree.
I think the fact is that there will be transactions that would happen anyway. And if we are creating this sense of aspirational value, if we're actually genuinely using service mindset, then the reason we're getting you to go to our experience, that kind of transition moment from app to experience, that loyalty, that lore, that social engagement, whatever it is, we're creating an offer, effectively, a proposition that they want to care about. And I think by doing that in an authentic way means that you're unlocking a genuine desire of those players who want more from this game. A desire that isn't possible to unlock in the current infrastructure of the App Store without you having this kind of framework. And, you know, I don't think that's a negative for the App Store. I think they are performing a function. I mean, I have some negative thoughts about the App Stores, but that's a different subject. But the fact that I think, you know, we can actually genuinely add better experiences to players that keep them playing more because they want to, not because we're tricking them into some weird way of functioning, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's good evidence for this, which is that the only part of the games industry that's growing is PC. And that's the most competitive distribution environment. And I think it has fostered growth in that channel because you look at something like early access on Steam, right? That was a feature Steam launched in response to itch.io competing with it. And Steam's benefited from that more than anyone else, right? Like, you know, PC grew at 10% last year, roughly. Mobile declined. And so I think as direct consumer enables better player experiences, as you say, players will spend more money, the category will grow, and ultimately Apple and Google will make more money. I firmly believe that.
And I genuinely think the whole process of the Digital Market Act does bring mobile in particular, but generally, you know, cross-platform gaming, I think, will benefit as a complete piece because the subdivision of the market has made it more complicated. Whereas we, as builders of brands, why are we caring which device you play on, other than the ergonomics? I mean, there are ergonomic issues, but other than that, I don't care if I'm playing on my Steam Deck or my Switch. At the end of the day.
Completely agree, and I think that, you know, I think we're at the last stages of people holding on to something that's been very nice for them, you know, and they don't want to give it up, and they don't like change. But ultimately, like, you know, I always give the example of, like, when Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, first thing Rockefeller said when he was informed of the Supreme Court's decision was buy Standard Oil, because he knew that it would be worth more broken up than it was together. And he was 100% right. He was never rich in his life.
No, exactly. That's been a legacy for some while.
Yeah.
But as I go back to the flow, just so, map it out for us again. So in terms of the journey, so I look at this journey from the lens of the sort of marketing language: awareness, interest, desire, action. And I added an element to that, which is retention. That's my way of looking at the flow. How do I get you aware that it exists, interested in doing something about it, give you a reason to act, and then once you act, reward you for that in such a way that you want to do it again? How do you map out this journey of integrating direct to consumer?
That's a really good way of thinking about it. I mean, I think it is an excellent way of thinking about it.
I wrote about this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I think about it probably in a slightly... So what's interesting is a lot of it kind of starts with the value of the channel. Because it's really a question of I think about it, bring them to the store, get them to do something, and then get them to come back. And so... bringing them to the store is a function of how broad, how much awareness are you driving and how compelling is your pitch, right? To use your language. So, awareness that's kind of a tactical question, right? It's how big is your out of app channel reach? That's great. The thing that really drives awareness for us is designing features, downstream features that you can actually inject into the flows that players are engaging with. So the creativity there is, how do I create systems that players can engage with that I can compliantly put in my game? And that's often loyalty or, content or something that is a good enough reason players will visit the website because you told them about it in game that isn't a discount. So once you've done that...
The top 5 strategies I wish I knew before I started playing this game.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, exactly. And you do, and some games have an easier job than others. If you have a creator community, you can use them, right? So assuming then you can actually get them to visit this site, I think then there is some friction in actually getting them to link their accounts that's really important to overcome. Because almost anything that's really they're gonna engage with requires them to link their accounts. And often, especially on mobile, they don't know they have a concept of an account yet because they've only engaged with it on this one device. Maybe their player progress is transferred from an old phone, but that's kind of done by Apple in the background. So asking them to remember some password they may have made when they first downloaded, or remember even if they logged in with Google or Facebook, they can't remember, is often very high friction. So, and yet the things that are really nice about the offering you're going to give require you to know who the player is for you to give them that offering, if it's loyalty or if it's a special discount. So we always try and use the device as the authentication device as the method. So, scan a QR code on desktop or click a deep link on mobile, and it opens the app, and then your game will say hi, do you want to link your accounts? And you'll say yes. And that's great because that's the one thing players have. And what you're trying to do is
taking all the friction out of it.
Yeah. And developers often don't have account systems that they're developers really have a concept of a device ID, right, for mobile. And so you're going from a device ID to a cross-platform identity. This is a great way to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I love the fact you mentioned QR codes there, because I remember back in 2003 when I first saw QR codes, I went, this is obvious. Why are we not doing this everywhere? And it's taken till basically COVID. That's nearly 20 years, not quite, but not far off 20 years for that to become a thing that we now accept. Sorry, another tangent. I couldn't.
No, it's great. I agree. QR codes and deep links. Every time I use one of our authentication flows, I'm like, that was such a nice player experience. It's just so smooth good.
I could get my phone out and it works. That's nice. I don't have to type anything.
Yeah, so that's a great method. And again, you're not trying to win on friction, but you're trying to reduce friction as much as possible. Yes. So then I think what we try and do then is think about what is an immediate value you can kind of give them to positively reinforce things and get them to explore. So often that's some immediate reward, an account linking reward or something like that. A lot of the incentives you give on mobile to games are going to be commercial incentives. So I think about it as a mix between okay, what can you actually buy, and then what is the engagement functionality, and then what are you giving away? A lot of this is going to be intuitive in terms of discounts, first-time offers. A few kind of highlights I would flag are, we're in the games industry, and gamification is a nonsense word, but I do like to gamify this stuff. For example, daily engagement rewards on web shops are really common. One of the things we do at Stash that I'm really proud of as a system is turn a daily engagement reward into an idle game, where you know, and you can, and again, it gives you an opportunity to like expand your lore in your universe, even if you're a casual game. So instead of just logging in once a day to claim a reward, what we have is that, so when you log in, you have 3 characters, and you can send each character on a mission, and the mission is just a real-time counter for 12, 24 hours or a week. And each of those timers has a higher value product you can get with it. So I can choose, do I send them on the 12-hour mission, the 24-hour mission, or the 7-day mission? And what's great about that is, like, one, it's much more fun for players. 2, it gives you an opportunity to expand your lore and your narrative. So you can even do like status updates, like 6 hours into the journey, 12 hours in, that are like humorous and have some narrative to them. And then 3, it brings players back way more frequently, because rather than coming
you've
back
got something to come back for.
Yeah, and you're checking in your progress.